Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local community radio station that you are listening to, and my name is Andy, and I will be with you for the next hour. And we are on Jagger and Turrbal country, and today on the show we are going to be talking about the work of transitioning some of our rural areas, sometimes from extractive economies to more sustainable economies, sometimes transitioning them into energy infrastructure that they weren't previously a part of. It's not a very glamorous side of the climate movement, we might say, and one that requires a lot of hard work and the hard work of community building, which hopefully at the end of it we do get a better, cleaner energy infrastructure, but also that work of empowering communities and enabling people to talk and discuss ideas and work on, I guess, divisions within their community. Hopefully that has positive outcomes too. And so there are a lot of things that come from this, like anything in the climate mitigation sphere. This thing has been forced upon us by environmental necessity, but it doesn't have to be necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of good things that can come from changing and trying to figure out a better way of doing things. And hopefully one of those things is empowering rural areas in Australia, which are often sidelined by political and media narratives, but that actually generate so much of the energy we use in this country, the food we eat, and things like that. I guess those of us living in the city should not think of ourselves as distinct in some way from this process, because the electricity that we are using right now is being generated in a regional area, either from a coal-fired power plant or from a renewable resource, and we should take some responsibility for that as well. We are the ones, it's our demand that is part of the reason that's affecting these rural areas. And so today I spoke with Amanda Cahill from Next Economy and Allan from the Renewable Energy Alliance, both of whom have been out in regional areas in this country, talking to people there and trying to empower those communities to transition into cleaner economies that hopefully are better for everybody. So stick around if you are interested in learning about that. Of course, the climate crisis is something that it should be in our news all the time, because it's just of the utmost importance, but it doesn't have quite the same attention pull of other things that make the news, and so stories like this are rarely talked about, but this is the important day-to-day work of what might manage to keep us as a livable planet and as a society that manages to survive without destroying our home. So let's start with Amanda
Cahill, and I'm the founder of the Next Economy.
And can you tell us a bit about what the Next Economy is?
Yeah, so the Next Economy is a small not-for-profit organisation, and we work with regional communities to manage economic change. There's a lot of things hitting regional communities at the moment. and a lot of impacts, including, say, the impacts of decarbonisation. And our job is to work with them to find strategies to minimise the challenges and maximise the opportunities around that, but to actually transform our economies so that they are delivering well-being for people and planet. So they're climate resilient, they're regenerative, and they're fair as well. That's our mission.
Yeah, which is certainly a worthwhile but not so easy goal, and we'll come back to that. But for now, I guess let's talk about your work in rural communities. And I guess to start off with, why did you feel a need to do that kind of work?
Yeah, so we started in 2018, but the inspiration actually came back in 2014. I was volunteering with a couple of climate groups and got asked to do a presentation up in North Queensland alongside Tim Buckley. He's a financial analyst, and he was doing these presentations on the structural decline of coal. And people started asking him, like, what do we do about this? You know, he was in places like Mackay that are very dependent economically on the coal industry. And he's like, I don't know, I don't do economic development stuff. And so one of the climate activists reached out to me and said, don't you do this kind of work? And I did, but in the Pacific on poverty alleviation. So they said, look, you know, just give people the basics if they want to start planning for a different future. And I thought it was a one-off, but actually what happened was after the presentations, people from the business community and government started reaching out saying, hey, you know, I'm not into the climate stuff, but if he's right and the economy's changing, we need to start now. So that's how it kicked off. I was getting requests from up there, then I was getting requests from Latrobe Valley and the Hunter Valley, and there was this real groundswell of interest from coal mining communities saying we need to be pragmatic about this and start diversifying our economy. So that work just kept growing and growing over 4 years until I was like, okay, I need to set up an organisation to deal with this.
There's sort of two types of rural communities that are affected by the transition. There's those mining communities like the ones you've just mentioned, but then there's also places which I suppose haven't had big infrastructure previously but now are having big renewable projects built. Are you working with those kind of communities as well?
Yeah, so we work across different sectors. So we do a lot of work in energy, but we're also doing a lot of work in agriculture. And also now getting requests from places that have the potential for critical minerals mining as well. So the three kind of classic examples that really sort of sum up the work that we're doing is long-term work in Gladstone, so a big industrial centre. So it's not just about moving away from fossil fuels like coal and gas and to renewables, but it's how does industry and manufacturers also adapt and transform their businesses, and what new things can that place make? Like, can they do metals processing, for example? We've done a big project up in Mount Isa that we launched earlier this year, which is what's the future of a place like Mount Isa and what role can it play in terms of producing the critical minerals that the world needs for renewable energy, but also processing some of those minerals, drawing on renewable energy, big renewable energy projects out there. And then the third flagship project we're working on at the moment is in far western New South Wales with the Hay Regional Council, looking at sort of the intersection between agriculture, needing to change and decarbonise, not just to deal with climate impacts, but also to stay relevant around trade requirements, around decarbonisation. But at the same time, they've got a whole lot of big renewable energy projects came in. So the council wanted to be on the front foot of saying, what does this look like if we can grasp the opportunities and do development well, but do it on our terms? So at the heart of the work is actually equipping people on the ground, particularly local governments, with the tools they need so that they can actually shape development and make sure it's good development on their terms.
Now, I can say this because I'm from the country, but there's not always a lot of willingness to accept change in rural communities. Is this something that's a challenge for you, or is part of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, the work is really change management. And I grew up in regional areas as well. I went to a one-teacher school for most of primary. And I think, people have some legitimate questions. And I think a lot of the opposition we're seeing isn't always just about the projects that are coming in now. It's actually people standing up to being on the receiving end of development over the decades that haven't necessarily been done well or had the best outcomes for communities. They've often received the brunt of the cost and seen biodiversity loss, but not the benefits from that. So we're not there to advocate for change. We're asked in by communities experiencing change, and our job is to help them figure out what does it actually mean, what's real, what's not real, and in a time where there's a lot of misinformation. And what are their rights and what can they expect, and then how do they work towards that? And how do they have a conversation across the community where there's very different agendas and interests to get to a place where they can actually make some decisions and move forward? And it's really tough for councils right now. They're sort of being bombarded on every side. So our job is to help them sort of figure it out, make sense of it, and then strategise about how they can move forward or not. Or like if it is legitimate to actually try and oppose projects, what are their rights in that case? How do they get help? So it's really to support them.
Yeah, that is an interesting side of it, because obviously there's a lot of work that needs to be done for energy transition, but not every project is necessarily good for the environment in the long term or for the communities they're in.
Yep.
I guess, do you have an idea of how best to kind of manage that? There seems to be often these people in the city that just think renewable should be built at any cost, and then in rural communities there's a lot of opposition. Is there some way of finding a good balance?
I think it's going to be case by case, unfortunately, and I think we want to rush ahead and draw some lines on a map and get it done, because there is some real pressure, time pressure around this, not just from a climate perspective, and there are some real pressures around that, but also from attracting investment. There's kind of a window of time that things need to be built, and that process needs to be managed, including the ramping down of fossil fuels, because you can't just add a whole lot of renewables to the grid. And so it's complex technically, and I think that's, it's not that there's a whole lot of just evil developers out there. There's actually a lot of really good people trying to do the right thing that have a lot of pressure on them. And then there's the specific context in which these things are going into. And, I'm a believer in, if we can take the time and have good process more times than not, we're going to have a much better outcome. And we don't necessarily have to sacrifice it. It's not all or nothing. Let's find the way through that's actually going to minimise as much damage or avoid damage to try, but also generate the benefits we need. And that sounds naive and idealistic, but time and again, I've seen it over the last 30 years of working with communities. If we have the right information, right process, we can put that challenge to engineers saying, what's the design solution? Here are your design parameters. These are the things we want at the end of this. Here are the things we don't want. Come up with a solution for us. Unfortunately, the pressures around money and time and politics sometimes get in the way of that process being as good as it could be.
I'm interested to know if you have an example of a transition that has worked well that you think is sort of ideal to be aspired to, and maybe one that hasn't worked well that kind of shows up some of the issues.
Yeah, I think there's processes to point to, I think, that work well. I think it's a really messy time that we're in the middle of, so it's not like everyone's still going through transition. I did Churchill Fellowship in 2023 and went to Europe, and we sort of were holding them up as the good example, but there's still complexities there. I think the work we did in Gladstone a few years ago, we launched the Economic Transition Roadmap working with Council over 2 years, is a good example of process that led to some really great outcomes. And we took 2 years working with the Council to engage across the community, like everyone, unions and workers, farmers were involved, public, all levels of government, industry, investors. It was really comprehensive. And trying to find the things that people agreed on, trying to find the questions people had, trying to map out what different scenarios looked like over time. And that led to a very comprehensive, I think a 70-page kind of roadmap of going, well, here are some priorities, here's the sort of ideals and vision of the community, this is what they want, here are the challenges we need to address, here's what we think needs to be done to address those challenges and seize those opportunities across lots of different sectors. And what it did was, it was really interesting, it wasn't even expected really, by a community being on the front foot. They know their situation better than anyone else. With some support and resources, by putting that out there, they ended up attracting a lot more in good investment of the sort that they wanted because they had a vision. And so the people who aligned with that said, oh, great, we want to do that too, let's talk. So they had a lot of investment, national and international investment. Both state and federal government could get behind it because it was clear what they needed from different levels of government. And actually some of the ideas that came out of that roadmap ended up informing federal policy when Labor took charge in 2022. Like, a big reason we've got now a national authority to help regions manage this transition is because of the work in Gladstone. So it's not just, I think that's a good example of process. Unfortunately, there's also been a lot of politics that have gotten in the way of some really great ideas and some really good investment in that region as well. So it's sort of also an example of how things can get in the way of even when there is goodwill and good process and good evidence for that, in terms of investment by the state government being pulled out of hydrogen, for example. And there's complex reasons for that. So I think it's an example of just how messy it is, even when it's going in the right direction, sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back in a lot of cases. Another example would be, I guess, that people point to would be, we've got lots of examples of bad transition. I think it's been, a lot of people talk about the Latrobe Valley, and when Hazelwood closed, that there was, 6 months sort of time frame to sort of, after the announcement of the closure, for people to scramble. And so trying to do transition after things have started to happen is much harder. So it's an example of how you need to be on the forefront of this and be in advance, otherwise it's going to roll over the top of you.
Yeah. Well, finally, I guess you did mention that part of the vision is not just helping rural communities to cope with changes that are happening, but to try to shape the economy to be something that's better overall, fairer, more sustainable. And I think a lot of us that were in the climate movement, this is maybe part of our motivating factor, that it's not just about protecting the atmosphere, but about that this has a potential to reshape society as a whole. And I don't know that it's done that very well, but do you want to share some thoughts on that, on like the potential for broader changes to the economy from these kind of changes that we're making now?
Yeah, I think there's a new appetite everywhere we go for a discussion about the economy in a way that I've never seen before in Australia, because it's not delivering what people need. So we've actually got a whole program of work now called Around the Wellbeing Economy, and having discussions around, well, what would the economy look like if it was delivering benefits for everyone? But even the sort of more mainstream work is building in questions to say, okay, is this, what's coming down the line, or what's the issue that you're dealing with? So, for example, in Hay, like a lot of communities, they're struggling with housing, but they've got all these renewable energy developments coming in. So then the question is, well, how do we, is there a way to address our housing needs through the sort of new investment that's coming in? So instead of community benefits being, the footy shirts type example and sponsoring events, can we pull that money in a way that we can actually get some significant investment in the type of housing that we want, and what would that look like? So, but then that leads to other questions of, it's not just, building a house. Who owns the house? What sort of people, what's the arrangement? Is it for rental? Is it social housing? Is council going to manage it? So all these questions around governance and ownership and management of infrastructure come back to questions of, the economy, because you can have very different outcomes. If you look at the electricity system, we have community-owned energy. We have household-owned energy. That's not necessarily it's that's very different setup to having a very large energy company owning all of the electricity generation and poles and wires. In Queensland, still 60% of our energy is managed by government-owned corporations. So it's government-owned, it's public. So the economic logics that flow from those different arrangements is very different. Is it a private commodity, be traded to make as much money as possible in the case of private energy companies? Is it a public good or a public service that the state has a responsibility to maintain? Or is it community owned, and what happens to the financial benefits that come from that arrangement? And we've seen examples like Hepburn Wind in Victoria, for example, where that money goes back into the community. So we have a mix. I think we actually do have lots of economic opportunities that already exist, and we've got to make them visible and start having some more open conversations about what we're choosing to build and how.
All right, well, thanks very much, Amanda. If people want to find out more about what Next Economy does, how can they do that?
Yeah, just you can sign up on our website to our newsletter. It's nexteconomy.com.au, and yeah, check us out.
All right, thanks very much, Amanda.
Thank you.
You are listening to 4ZZZ. Paradigm Shift is the show, and we're speaking with Amanda Cahill from Next Economy, who has been out in regional areas of this country working on transitioning our energy infrastructure and the economy in those areas, and doing a great job, an important part of some of the many changes that we need to make if we are going to be a society that is sustainable and one that doesn't totally destroy the planet that we live in and the ecosystems and our atmosphere. Somebody else who's been doing the same is Allan, who works for the Renewable Energy Alliance, and I spoke to Lou as well about her experiences out in the regions.
Hi everyone, I'm Allan. I'm the Advocacy Director at the Renewable Energy Alliance.
Well, before we get further into the interview, could you start off by telling us what is it that the Advocacy Director does?
So I work with a team of people who live and work in renewable energy zones across the country. And their job is really to help those communities understand what's happening in the transition to renewable energy, understand what to expect in the rollout, and help advocate for the regional leaders in those communities and the things that those communities need as renewable energy is being rolled out. And so we'll work with regional leaders who might be working inside local government or from other community groups outside of local government who are trying to make sense of everything that's happening. There's a lot of different companies, agencies, government departments, and different entities all working in the space, all talking to their community about what they're going to do, and it can be quite confusing. So we're in there trying to help people make sense of it all, and also advocating to government and to industry about how things need to be done better for regional communities and making sure they can realise more of the opportunities that are coming from renewable energy development.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic that when it comes to the energy transition, that so much of, I guess, the decisions made about, you know, what projects go ahead or what don't, that happens in big cities, and a lot of the media discourse about, you know, pro-climate action or against renewables, that comes from media that's in the cities as well. But the actual logistics of, you know, transitioning from one energy industry or energy source to another mostly happens in rural communities, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And there's a mix of what that looks like as well. So you've got some regions that are traditional energy generation regions. So places like the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, the Hunter in New South Wales. These places have as part of their history and as part of their identity as contributing to the rest of the country through coal and through fossil fuels and as energy generators. But now they're having to make the switch But then on top of that, there are lots of other regions as well who might be more traditionally agricultural regions, and they've never been large energy generation regions. And so they're almost having to manage a level of infrastructure that some regions have never actually seen before and become big parts of the energy system for the first time.
So what's the importance of work like what you do with trying to do, I guess, community consultation in these spaces where these projects are happening?
Yeah, I suppose with any large-scale development, there are lots of risks. Risks that promises won't be kept, risks that there will be environmental and social impacts that are left unaddressed, risks in disruptions to the region, and basically risk that services will be taken up during construction and not adequately mitigated for. And these risks are inherent to any large-scale infrastructure build. And at the same time, there's lots of opportunities, but these opportunities need to be worked for to be realised. So I'm talking about things like local jobs, upskilling local community members so that they can take up those job opportunities, securing work for local businesses, and creating community benefits that can feed into contributing to the community in an ongoing way, as well as, the direct benefits, payments to landholders, payments to neighbours. There's plenty of opportunities that can come about from the development as well. So while the risks are inherent to the development and have to be managed, the opportunities need to be worked for. They're not automatic. So for the opportunities to be realised, it really needs local communities to be organised, to understand what happens when a developer comes into town and is knocking on the door and talking about their new flashbang project, and to be ready for that conversation and how they can essentially get the best deal for their region.
Your focus there on the opportunities for regional areas is a very positive spin on it that not all the regional areas themselves necessarily have. There has in recent years been this real wave of opposition to renewable energy projects in a lot of regional areas, certainly in the sort of eastern half of Australia. I guess, can you tell us a bit about that? Is that something that you are coming across?
Yeah, we see definitely a bit of opposition. What we know is that about 70% of regional Australians in renewable energy zones do support the transition to renewables in the general sense. So there is this broad understanding and support that we need renewables. We know where we're going. We know what needs to happen. But that support is a little bit tenuous when you drill down into it, because people might have had a negative experience with a project in their local region. They might think, yeah, we need to build it, but maybe here's not the right place. Or they might be concerned about some of the impacts that come with development. They might be environmental impacts or so on. Or in some cases, people are just ideologically opposed or strongly opposed to renewables, full stop. And, we don't have to convince everyone. We don't need to bring everyone along. Some people will always be opposed to renewable energy. But yeah, that's essentially what we're working with. I'd say, the media can often play up the amount of opposition that's there. It tends to be that small number of loud voices in some regions that we see. But, I don't want to dismiss opposition at the same time. Sometimes there are genuine reasons why they might be opposing a particular development in their region. People oppose developments for a whole number of reasons, and some of those reasons are legitimate, and they come from a concern about some of the impacts not being mitigated or not being addressed. And on top of that, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. And so people are responding to what is quite a complex information environment, and people might not have a good understanding of what the impacts are and how they're being mitigated already or how they're not. And there's a lot of people out there trying to, I suppose, mislead people on what renewable energy projects might mean for their region or what the impacts might be. So, yeah, I think support and opposition is always more complex than support and opposition. But we're just in there trying to help people make sense of what's happening. We'll work with anyone who wants to work with us, and sometimes that includes people who have a lot of concern about development but just want to make sure that their community gets the best deal, essentially, from the development that's happening.
You mentioned misinformation, and I guess there's various vested interests in this, and the resources companies, the mining companies that have been in these areas for a long time, and some of the National Party politicians which are closely linked to them. I guess they do have an interest in furthering their own industries and stopping competitors. Does that play a role? Do you think that there's an element of like the vested interests that are trying to interfere with these kind of projects?
Yeah, I think that's true. There's definitely a lot of fossil fuel vested interest or fossil fuel backed campaigns that are fueling misinformation. And just, decades of millions of dollars of spending from the Minerals Council and from these different bodies who essentially have convinced Australians by and large that coal and gas support the backbone of the Australian economy and without it would be wrecked, when actually it, has provided a relatively small portion of our jobs and economic growth. So I think there's a long game that these companies have been playing, and we're not just up against, I suppose, in the short term what people might be seeing in the media or on TikTok or whatever it might be, but this long-term play of the Australian rural and regional identities almost becoming synonymous with mining and coal and gas. And so, yeah, there's a mix of factors there. I will say, though, there's vested interests on the renewable side too. So there's multiple systems there at play, and, there is money in renewable energy development. And yes, we want renewables, but sometimes, you have to acknowledge, like, we're working for technology which has a lot of players which also have vested interests. So the space that we work in, we have to tread very carefully, because we can't just go and say, hey, well, that's disinformation, there's vested interest, blah, 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 because while these companies that are bringing the technology, they're making a profit too. And they also have advertising campaigns and persuasive messages that are trying to convince people as well. So really on the ground, what that means is it's a complicated information space, and we're just in there trying to help people make sense of it all.
It is a question, I guess, that people who are interested in climate action, obviously we need a huge amount of changes to our energy infrastructure if we're going to mitigate the damages done by our fossil fuel emissions. But I guess it is a question of whether every renewable project is good, and in Queensland we've had like the LNP scrapping one of the biggest planned projects, the Pioneer Burdekin Dam, and I guess it gets reported in a certain way, but there was a lot of community opposition to that, and I guess that's one example where it does sort of bring up, well, what developments are good, and how do we need to measure what is a good renewable project and what's not?
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I think you've hit on what is, I think, one of the biggest challenges, and what I think is one of the most interesting challenges for environmentalists and progressives and climate activists in 2025 and beyond is, well, if we do need this renewable energy infrastructure to meet all of our renewable energy and climate goals, which we do, how do we then engage in that huge mammoth industry in a way where we are facilitating the builds that we need, but we're also not just allowing anything through. We're not just saying yes to everything, and we're being quite critical about what's actually needed, what's greenwashing, how can we find ways to not just do business as usual, but for companies and for projects to contribute to local environments in ways that they have never done before. So I think the challenge now is for environmentalists and for climate activists to forge a new path, a new type of environmentalism, which is not backing away from our strong environmental principles, and not backing away from holding corporations to account, which we're really good at, but having to try and do both at the same time. And that can look like different things. It can look like stopping projects that are not good for the environment. It can look like saying yes to projects that we think, are good for the environment, that do meet the criteria, and also helping articulate what a project looks like that might have best practice environment principles employed. So how can, for example, we contribute to local environments by planting shrubs or grasses or native plants under solar panels, and support local species in that area, be it birds or insects, by planting things that are useful to that species? How can we make sure that companies are incentivized to share their environmental data? I mean, these renewable energy companies collect so much environmental data as part of their planning, but most of the time that's just locked behind closed doors and not accessible to environmentalists who are trying to understand where there might be a particular species, or how things are growing and developing or changing. This environmental data is very useful. So how can we encourage the industry to share that in a way that's safe and appropriate? So there's all kinds of things that we can do when we can work with the industry, and we need to figure out how do we do that in a way that doesn't compromise our strong environmental principles, and helps facilitate the growth of a new industry, which we do need, but that it's not just business as usual development.
Well, if we are going to get the kind of climate action that is required for our lifestyles, it's going to mean a lot more renewable projects being built, and most likely a lot of them are going to be in rural areas. So I guess in your perspective, what are the things that needs to be done well to enable the building of the kind of energy infrastructure that we need, and are those things being done well now?
Yeah, I think it's, as always, mixed. We're definitely seeing better practice all the time from the industry. Things definitely are improving. It's not just industry practice you have to look at too. You also have to look at environmental planning systems. I mean, development is occurring under a framework, and we know that our environmental planning laws in states and nationally, it's not enough. And that's why lots of people have been fighting for stronger protections through the federal EPBC laws, for example. So we do need to improve our frameworks for development. We do need to improve developer practice as well, and we need people to be engaging with those projects and holding people to account, and also just supporting projects that are good projects. A good project, it might not be that interesting. It might be on cleared agricultural land. It might not be doing too much damage. It might just be there. It might have a community benefit fund. It might be doing a couple of things, but it's a large-scale infrastructure project, and it is important for climate. And so, yeah, I think one of the most powerful things that climate activists can do is support large-scale renewable energy projects to be built well and on time. And both of those things are really important. And being able to hold that balance where we're holding corporations to account, but also saying yes to the things that we need, because what's happening in regional Australia at the moment is people who are opposing renewable energy projects are usually the loudest voices, and people that support the projects might be a little bit quiet. It's difficult for people sometimes in regional communities to stick their necks out and support something that's unpopular or that a small, loud group of people are opposing. And so it is important that the support for renewable energy that's there becomes visible, and also that if we're climate activists and if we're environmentalists, that we're engaged in projects that might be built in our region or in a region not far from us, and we're able to, I suppose, meet with the developers, talk to them, understand what's happening and suggest ways that the projects can be built better, but also to support the projects that are just doing the right thing. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting and powerful role that activists can play. It's not the most straightforward, yes, we support that, no, we don't support that. It's this sort of double-handed role we have to play. But when it's done well, I think it's a really powerful way that climate activists and environmentalists can support climate action.
All right, thanks, Lou. Is there anything else that you wanted to leave us with?
Maybe one thing I'll shout out is our campaign for local energy hubs. We're currently asking the federal government to fund a national network of 50 local energy hubs for regional Australia. These hubs will be service centres where people can find help to lower their energy bills and find good information about the kinds of upgrades they might want to do to their house to save money, save electricity, but also support local businesses and agriculture in what they need to do to electrify and decarbonise if that's something that they want to do. And these local energy hubs, they'll be staffed with trusted local people, outreach officers who can go out and meet people where they are and help improve energy literacy for the region and help people access just the number of government incentives and schemes available. We know that people aren't accessing those schemes as much as they could be and not saving as much money and as much electricity as they could be just because people don't know they exist. So, yeah, we need these local energy hubs to help people navigate all parts of the transition to renewable energy. So, yeah, if you'd like to support that campaign, you can head to our website. But, yeah, I just thought I'd let everyone know that's something we're asking Chris Bowen and the federal government to support at the moment. And, yeah, really appreciate having the opportunity to speak today. And, yeah, thanks so much, Andy.
No worries. Thank you, Lou. That is Lou Allan on the Paradigm Shift, speaking about her efforts with the Renewable Energy Alliance to help the regional areas of this country with the big transitions that are happening and that are going to be required to happen more if we are to take seriously the challenge in front of us of a sustainable society that can coexist with a healthy climate for humans and all the other species on this planet. And both Renewable Energy Alliance and Next Economy, which we interviewed earlier in the show, Amanda Cahill, they're both out there doing plenty of work, hard work, and they both have their own sort of resources you can read if you're interested in seeing more. And yeah, this type of work, I guess, is one thing that's not talked about very much in the climate space, but it is a really valuable part of what is a big task ahead of all of us, and one that we need to take seriously. It's not just for some experts somewhere. It is all of us. It's all of our climate, and all of us are somehow involved in the destruction of it. So let's do it together. We'll definitely have a better chance of it if we're working together and learning the strategies and tactics that different social movements can use. And so we'll keep trying to help keep you informed on the Paradigm Shift, and I'll see you at same time, same place on the radio.